Hello, this is Reed Copsey. In today's video, we'll cover the buildings module. Now, I think that very few people really know its full potential. And once you learn how to use this module, I believe that you'll appreciate that as an EVS user, you'll be able to create 3D buildings to annotate your models much faster than you can have it done by your CAD department. So we're going to start. Now, I'm starting off with an application that I've borrowed the basics of from the coastal facility apps. So we're using Creek 3D Geology and Geologic Surface to extract the ground surface alone from the coastal facility applications. And you could create this application yourself by just opening those and deleting the modules, just leaving Creek 3D Geology. So I have the topographic surface, and it's not perfectly flat. You can see there's a little bump here where the bushes are, and it drops off just a tiny bit towards the coastline, but it's relatively flat. And we're going to show you how to add some of the buildings on this site, which are obvious from the aerial photo, but what you can see are not there because it's just a surface with an aerial photo draped on it. So once we add the buildings to this aerial photo, we're going to make this model look far more realistic. So we start with the buildings module, and you'll notice how it's hooked up. It requires two connections, one going to the viewer with a special purple port and another one going to the viewer with its red port, so you can see the buildings that you create. And you'll notice also that it's red across the bottom, which means it has no output. That's a good thing to be aware of. This is an important feature in all of our modules. If you see that red band, then any module there or any downstream modules won't have output. So this has no output because we've created no buildings, nor have we read a file that contains buildings yet. So it's just connected, ready to use, but it's not doing anything. All right, now when you start using the buildings module, you need to change the probe action. So I'm going to start off with the probe action set to none. That means that when I probe, as I would for just interrogating a surface or post-sample spheres in order to find out what their values and locations are. But when we have another active module connected with a purple port, we can use probing to create objects or draw lines with the draw lines module and other things like that. Now, the other feature that I'm going to show you and take advantage of is the measure distance, the distance tool that is part of the viewer. So you're only going to see that when the viewer is the selected object. So in other words, if you switch over here to buildings, that's gone now. When I go back to just clicking on the viewer itself, the distance tool will pop up. And the reason that I started off with the probe action set to none is that I want to probe using the distance tool to get some information first. So as you're adding buildings, you're going to zoom in and focus on an area where you have buildings. And you also want to try to get a sense of how tall the buildings are. Now, obviously, if you've been to the site or if someone else has been to the site and they can measure the heights of the buildings, then you can add more accurate buildings. But one of the other things I want to point out is that it's very common that we'll work on a site and need some vertical scale. In this particular case, the vertical scale that we inherited from the coastal applications was 5. And so very often you've got a vertical scale for your geologic layers, but if you created the buildings with Z-scale 1 and you scale the buildings, they'll start to look ridiculous. In other words, we all have a good knowledge of what a building should look like. We know that commercial buildings, are for their large size like these are going to be not as high as they are wide or long. And we know kind of what a tank should look like. These tanks might be 2 or 3 times as tall as their diameter at most. But if we applied a vertical scale of 5, they could be 10 or 15 times their diameter, and they would look ridiculous. So we generally want to redraw these 3D buildings to be in the correct Z coordinates, which means we need to create them on the surface that has the Z scale we plan to use. But we don't normally want to exaggerate them, usually at all. Sometimes you can put a mild vertical exaggeration, and the buildings module has 2 ports. It has a Z scale, that it uses to know what, when you're probing, what the true coordinate should be, because it's going to divide by the z-scale. And then it has a totally separate building height scale. And that allows you to scale the buildings if you want to, or if they were drawn z-scale 1 and you want to unscale them, you can. But the problem is you need to make sure that if you're planning on a z-scale of 5 for your final visualization, that you place them at elevations that correspond to the 5. There's no way to z-scale the base elevations of these buildings and not z-scale the entire buildings. So with that, we're going to start. Now I'm going to start off by doing these pair of buildings here. You could consider this one building, but it actually, I know from having been there, that there's a gabled roof with a ridge along this line and another gabled roof. So there's two gabled roofs, so this creates a valley down the middle. And so we need to treat this as two separate buildings. If we go back to the viewer and we use the measure distance, we can get a decent idea of the length of this building, so that when we start off we can have a good guess. So we probe at the top and probe at the bottom, and it gives us the coordinates of those 2 points. But now over in the information window, and I can expand this a little bit, it's going to tell us the line length. And it also tells us the line length and the true line length in 2D, so the line length in the XY plane. In this case, they're virtually identical. Not exactly identical, because there is some topography. And again, line length is what we're looking for, the 2D line length. So about 117.3. So when we create our building, we're gonna want to know that. The other thing to be aware of is that the gabled roofs, excuse me, I didn't mean to change the color here. I was planning on clicking on this box. The type of buildings, if you're adding a roof gable, the roof gable is going to be perpendicular to the width. So perpendicular to the length. So in this case, the length would be here, the width would be here, and that gives us a gable along this direction. But we're not going to draw the gable first, we're going to draw a box first. And that'll be really clear why we do that. So I'm going to create a box, and I'm going to switch this over. Now I'm going to turn off the measure distance. When you do that, the line and the points go away. I'm going to set the probe action to add building. And down here under current building values, that's going to be where our building's going to go. Up here is the default we want to use. We're going to default to creating boxes, and we'll just use the default heights because we're going to change those. And then the goal here is to try to do your best guess at picking a point in the center. So there's this box, and it's not oriented correctly, it's not rotated correctly, and it's not the right size. So I told you we want to make the width 117.3. And when I do that, that's for the default. Down here, we're going to make the width 117.3. And we need to orient this building, and we can do it manually, and we'll do that in a second. I didn't measure the length, the direction this way, but my memory, just to save some time, I'll tell you, is that length is about 33. And we want this building to be about 10 high. Everything here is in meters. So at this point, I want to rotate this building. And when I grab this wheel, it's very hard to get super accurate because of just the position. But if you look at my cursor, as I move my cursor further away, it gives me a longer radius with which to make these subtle angle changes. And now I'm able to dial this in a lot more accurately. So I think that's about where I want it to be. So we just look at what this looks like. Here it is. It looks pretty reasonable. You can see because of the topography, wasn't perfectly flat for the building foundations, and that's just because we didn't have a lot of good information that defined the elevations along the foundation of the building to be constant elevation. But we might want to actually lower that, because you can see here in the middle it's above the ground surface. So we could lower that here, and we have a vertical scale of 5, so if we just make it to be 1, it's going to drop it down, and that bottom looks pretty close now. You can see the sides are being sunk into the sides of the hillsides a little bit, but that's okay. Well, I'm fine with that. And now this is aligned pretty well. It's actually, I think, just almost exactly where I want it, but I could move it downward just slightly. It looks like it's a little bit high relative to the top of the building and maybe a little bit low. Or perhaps the building's a little too long. So if I want to make the building a little shorter, I'll just make it 117. And now you see there's a little white at the bottom and it's over the top at the top. Now I've rotated my view. We're not in a top view right now. We're slightly off of a south view. So I predominantly want to go down in Y, and I could do this manually, or I can just switch the probe action to be reset position. When I change it to reset position, I can move this building around every time I click. So I'm holding down the control key and I'm clicking with my left mouse. And so I can just move the mouse ever so carefully. And if you made your screen full screen, if you're working at a higher resolution monitor, it's a lot easier to make these choices very accurately. So I'm going to say that looks pretty good to me, and I'm just going to leave it there. All right, so if we like these dimensions, we're going to move these dimensions 117 even and a length of 33 and an orientation of 67.82. We're going to move these up to the default building, and now when I probe again with add building as the probe action, I can place another identical building like this. So I'm going to try to guess that the center is about right there. That was pretty darn good, and you can see oh, I didn't change the height. I needed to change the height to be 10. Oh, and it's down here that I need to change the height. Sorry. And now you can see it's pretty close. It's not precise because you can see that there is an offset in Z and there's an offset in the close to the Y dimension. So the other building, the first building, is here. And if we leave this toggle on for outlining current building, you can see that the white line shows me which building I'm looking at. This building, we set its Z-axis or Z-coordinate to be at 1.6. I thought we changed it to 1, but I think that apparently it's 1.6. So if we now go to this building and we lower this to be 1.6, there should be no height offset. So if we look at this directly on, you can see that they're at the same height. There's a slight gap between them, which I don't mind. I could make it a little smaller perhaps. But I do need to move it downward a little bit. It's just a little bit too high. Now I could, almost see that difference in Y better when I look at it this way. So I'm going to just try to do that by changing the Y coordinate, just make it a little lower. Move it down to be 0.4. Now I can't make it the same as the Y coordinate for the other one because these buildings are not orthogonal to the coordinate axes. So I need to come down a little bit further. I'm just going to come down all the way to, and that was too far, 466. We'll split the difference. And that looks really close. And for this stuff, my opinion is really close is good enough. So we want to move it to the right, a little higher X coordinate. So I'm going to try 426. It looks like there's still a tiny gap. That's good. It went down because of the angle a little bit. So we need to move it back up a little bit. And so I'm going to just change this to be 6. And that, again, looks pretty close, but I think maybe we want to go a little bit higher, 8. And I think that's close enough, especially once we're looking at this in perspective. So we've got a small gap between them, and we probe those two buildings. Now I'm going to do 2 more buildings before I go on to do gables, so we're just going to do the boxes first, and you'll understand why in a minute. So let's go back to a top view, and let's look over here, and we'll see, you can see the gabled roof here. You can see the difference in slope in the ridge line. So we need to place, this is one long building, And let's get an idea of how long it is rather than have to guess right off the bat. So we'll turn our probe action back to none. We're going to measure distance. We try to probe, holding down Control key. I probe up in this corner. In fact, let me zoom in better. I probe up in this corner and in this corner. And by the way, you can change the size of that little probe point in the viewer, and it's right here. The color of it is here, and the size of it, the color of the line is here, fuchsia, and the size is there in the radius in real units. So if you want to make it smaller or larger, this is where you do it. The default value is 10. I've already reduced it for this application. Okay, so it tells us that that line length is 229.5. So that's the width we want to set for our building. For the next one, we're going to probe 229.5. And we know that this building, at least on first glances, appears to be perpendicular to this one. But it tells us the actual angle of that line, and that's the aspect. Now, that's the angle of the line. We want to know the perpendicular to that, so all we do is subtract 90 degrees. So from 249.6, we're going to subtract 90 degrees, which gives us 159.6. So I'm going to go ahead and set that as an azimuth into the default setting so that the building I probe will get that value. I'm going to turn off measure distance, switch the probe action to add building again, and then take my best shot at a center point. Wow, that was pretty darn good. I've been doing this a long time, but it was pretty darn good. I'm going to switch this now to reset so I can try to move it around. My first guess at move was not as good as my first guess. And that looks pretty good. Now, I guess that the width of this building and the length of this building, because that's the length direction, and the length of this building would be the same. They're on the same site. They're similar looking in dimension, and so you can see that that default width or length of 33 worked really well for this building. Now we can rotate this and look at it, see if we think that the elevation is good. It appears that this part of the site is very flat, so I'm pretty happy with that elevation. Now let's go ahead and do this next building, and we'll assume that it's parallel to the first one because generally people do build that way. Likely the same length, 33, but it's obviously a very different width. So we'll switch our probe action back to none and measure distance again. And I can't see into this cloud, so I'm not going to try to pick that point, but I'll just go down here and pick this one. And it's telling us 128. I'm not going to use the quarter, I'm just going to call it 128. So this one was 230, this one's going to be 128, and we're going to turn off measure distance, switch back to add building, and I'm going to probe this point. And now I'm going to switch it over to be reset, and when I can move it around a little bit, and frankly it looks like it's not a great angle, and it looks like it's not wide enough either. You see that? It looks like this building is now wider than what I chose. So we'll go down here and wider, I should be using the term length. We're going to switch the length from 33. Let's see what 35 looks like. Still not big enough. Let's go 38. That looks better. And now let's go back and reset its position. And it looks like we need to rotate it. So again, I'm going to click on the needle for the heading, but then move away so that having a longer arm, my small motions aren't limited to a single pixel up close, and I can more accurately orient it. And that looks pretty good, maybe a little less. Still looks like it needs to go up, so I'll go, again we have the reset position set as our probe action. We'll go up just a tiny bit. And you want to not move wildly. You make a change, try to move just a pixel or two. That looks pretty good to me. Now there's a little halo around it, but that's not bad. Perhaps it could be a little further to the north. We could just go in here and try to change the Y coordinate, make it a little higher. That moved it up. Starting to see a little white on the bottom and a little bit of white on the top. You can maybe go a touch higher, try to balance that white ghost. It looks like it's similar on both sides. Now if we decide, we could make the building a tiny bit wider, but I've just got this white halo all around. This is not a very high resolution image to use, and that's part of why things are a little fuzzy. But I think we're good. So we now have 4 box buildings, all of which we oriented the width to be the direction that has the gable ridge. That's an important thing to remember if you're trying to do these commercial buildings that have a slope pitched roof. And so now I could try to draw them or position that other building type, which is building type 1, roof gable, on top of all these, but that's the hard way to go. We're going to do it the easy way. And so the easy way is to go here and save this file that we created. So I'm going to put this on my desktop, and I'm going to call this coastal, I have to spell coastal, 1.bldg. That is the suffix for building files. And I'm going to go find that and open it in a text editor. So I'm going to move my text editor down so you can see it. And this is the file that we've got. I'm going to stretch this out so the whole thing is visible to you. And I'll explain the different parameters in here. So we're seeing the entire file right now. Now, the first line is just how many buildings do we have. If you end up with 20 or 30 buildings and you only want to see the first 5, you can change the number of buildings to be 5 and it'll only read the first 5 lines. But again, the first line is just a header, just with the number of buildings, nothing else. And then you've got 4 lines of building data. Now, what's in these lines are X, Y, Z coordinate of the center of the building, and then length, which is the small dimension here for our buildings, width, and height. And then this is the angle orientation. Now, it says 22, and if we go and look at our first building that we did, we're going to see that our orientation for that building was 67.82. Okay, so it may seem strange that we have an angle of 22.18 when back in EVS for this building we had specified 67.82. But to be consistent with everything we do as far as views and such, we use a compass heading type declaration for orientations in all of our modules user interfaces. But the buildings module historically specified the angle from the x-axis where positive angles are counterclockwise and negative angles are clockwise. This is the standard used in all geometry and CAD, and so that's why these angles are the way they are. And actually, if we want to make these things perfectly oriented, I'll probably go in here and make just both of these to be the same. So we'll make the second one the same angle. It's a pretty tiny difference. And we did purposely change these two because they weren't exactly parallel when we tried to orient them. So we'll leave them alone. But so that's the explanation why this angle is different than what you saw in the user interface. So what I'm going to do now, though, is I'm going to take and copy all 4 of these lines, copy, and I'm going to paste them. And the next thing I want to do is change the building type. So we just said this is length, width, height, orientation angle, and then the next item that we come across would be the building type. So we know the first ones we drew were building type 0, but now we want gabled roofs, and I'm going to switch these over to be 1. Now I've copied the first 4 buildings, and now I've created 4 identical building coordinate sets, but they're a different building type. Is that everything I want to do? And the answer is no, it isn't. So the other thing I want to do is, first off, I want to make the height of the roof less than the height of the building. I know, having been there, that the roof height's about half of the building height. So I'm going to change these to be, actually I'm going to make them space 5 just to keep things lined up. So I'm going to change the heights of the gabled roof sections to be 5 instead of 10. And again, I'm just copying and pasting. And then the last thing I need to do is I need to raise these up, because I don't want their bases of the roof to be on the ground. I want the bases, the bottom of these roof sections, to be at the top of the buildings. So how high are the tops of the buildings? Well, this gets a little tricky, because you'd think, okay, buildings are 10, I would just add 10 to this. But remember that the z-coordinates here are scaled by 5. So we really only need to raise our roofs by 2, 1/5 of 10. So we're going to add 2 to the z-coordinates of all of the 4 of the roof sections. So this becomes 3, 3, 4, and 4. And we'll see if we got there. So I'm just going to change the number of lines to be 8. I'm going to save this. And we go back to our view. And right now, again, we have 4 buildings, 4 box buildings. We're going to open the file that we just created. Turn off the preview window and sort by date. These are ones I did for practice, just so I'd be a little less clumsy for you. So I'm going to read this file, Coastal 1. Now you'll notice instantly we have roofs on our buildings. Now you might not be quite as perfect the first time you do it, but the nice thing is you can go back and edit the file and reload it. But you can see by placing them the same exact size building with the same exact center, the same exact orientation, raising it up to account for the height of the building, adjusting that based on the z-scale that was set to be 5, we now have each of these precisely positioned. They're exactly the same place, exactly the same orientation, and they fit perfectly, seamlessly. You can't see any edges. So this is kind of the approach. Now I'm going to just do one more. I'm not going to try to do every one of these buildings because there's a lot here. But I'm going to do a tank for you. And there's a couple places where there's tanks. There's these 2 here and these 2 here. And I know from my own experience, you can see the shadow of this one is much bigger. These have a shadow that's decent size, bigger than our buildings. And so we know that all these tanks are taller than our buildings. I know this tank is about 2.5 times as high as these buildings, 25 or 30 meters tall. So I'm going to get ready to add a new building, and I want that building type to be a cylinder. And I'm going to make it a 32-sided cylinder. It makes it closer to being perfectly round. Now, these other 2 down here are horizontal tanks, like underground storage tanks. This is what we want in this case. So all I need to do is, I need to figure out the size, and let's again go back, switch this to none, go back to the viewer, and sometimes you're on the output, you need to click on the main viewer tab, and let's measure distance, zoom in on a tank. I'm going to do this one here first, and let's just measure across to try to get the diameter. Okay, it tells us that the line length is 21.5. So that's what we're going to use for our width and length. So we go in here and we set width and length to be the same. And we're going to set the height to be 25. And the azimuth doesn't matter because it's round. So just to keep it clean, I'm going to set it to 0. And now I'm going to turn off the measure distance, and I'm going to turn the probe action to add building, and I'm going to do my best to probe close to the center. And wow, I think I did a pretty good job. Let's look at it straight down. It could possibly be, it's round building, so I'm going to go to a top view, so set my azimuth to 0. And let's zoom in on a little bit more. I think perhaps it could be a little bit lower. And I'm just going to fix it by changing its coordinate down here. A little bit lower, I'm just going to say half a unit. That looks great. So let's see what it looks like when we rotate out. I think it looks pretty good. Now, what can make these look better is to put the same aerial photo on top of the buildings once you've got all the buildings done. So to do that, I can do this very easily. I'm going to turn off the red port so I'm not connecting the buildings directly. I'm going to copy this module, which already has my image specified, overlay aerial. This is the overlay aerial put on the ground. I'm just going to select this module. I'm going to hit Control C and then Control V. It makes a copy of it. I'm going to connect the buildings module to overlay area ground number 1, hook this up, and now there's my buildings. In this module, you can set the wall color. I'm going to say I want it to be gray, a kind of a medium gray. And now it looks like it just blends in really well with the roofs. And so you can see my tank in the top view disappears because it's the same photograph applied on it as the ground surface. In fact, all my buildings look like they're gone in the top view until I rotate and you start to see they're three-dimensional. How much more realistic does that look? And you'll be surprised. You don't need to do every building. You certainly can. But if you do the major buildings, people's eyes will fool them and they'll think everything is 3D. I've never done the cars here, but if you look at our coastal model, it has about 2 or 3 times as many buildings done, and you would not have thought that they weren't all done. Just your mind didn't go there, and you'll see. So just choose selectively do the major ones. Obviously, I would do these tanks because eyes go to the tanks. Maybe even do these little tanks over here, but I've never done those that I recall. I would certainly do these big buildings here, and maybe that long one there, and these couple back here. And maybe not do any of those, or maybe just one. And I think you'll find that if you showed it to someone and say, how'd you do the buildings? Their first comment will never be, well, you didn't do this one, and that one. They're just going to say they look good. And again, we could change that color a little bit. If we decide that it's too dark, we could say lighten it up a bit. And I think actually that maybe is a better color. It matches the color of the roofs better. All right, well, I hope that you've learned something useful, and that you can show off that you can create 3D buildings faster than your CAD department. Thank you.